Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the evening title Tuesday played on August 6th of the great year 2024. Now, this event featured many top 10 players as Title Tuesday has become one of the most prestigious tournaments in the world, but we are going to be focusing on a couple of games of one very specific player, and that would be the 5-time world chess champion Magnus Carlsen. Now, Magnus has had a bumpy road in recent times. He recently played in the Crunch Lab Masters. He didn't do very well. He's been dealing with some stuff family related. Don't want to get into that, but we all do wish Magnus nothing but the best. Anyway, today we are going to be focusing on Magnus's game. So first game we're going to be taking a look at is from round number 8, and this is a game where Magnus is currently on a score of 7 out of 7, a perfect score, and he's playing against Andreikin from Russia. So let's dive right into the action. The game starts with the move knight to f3. Magnus plays the move knight f6, and now we get this move g3. Here we have b5 being played by Magnus, and now we get this unusual move knight to a3. Now, the logic behind white playing knight to a3 is that if black goes b4 right away after knight to c4, down the road white can play either c3 or a3, trying to build a big white center potentially, just to illustrate the point, where you can capture towards the center and play for d4 here. Or you can also play for a3 and then open up the a file for the rook to target the pawn on a7. So Magnus plays move a6, protecting the pawn instead of going b4, and now we get to see the reason behind knight a3 in the first place, which is that now white plays c4, and the idea is that you want to put pressure on the pawn on b5. If black captures, once again you can play d4 d3 here, and white has a pretty standard position. So we get the move e6 from Magnus. Now here Andreikin plays move b3, and we get the move bishop b7, and now we have the move bishop g2 being played. White could possibly consider playing pawn takes pawn, but after takes, and bishop b2, black can now play something like c5, bishop g2, and d6, followed by knight bd7, and black is a very compact center here, and white really doesn't have any advantage at all. So Andreikin goes bishop g2. We get the move pawn takes pawn, knight takes, and now we have the move bishop e7. Here Andreikin castles, Magnus castles, and now we get the move bishop b2 being played. White has created the classic double fianchetto here with both the bishops on the diagonals. Magnus goes to a5, and now we get this move rook to c1. Here Magnus plays the move a4, trying to open up the a file potentially, or trade off the pawn on a4 for the pawn on b3. So Andreikin plays the move d3, Magnus takes, and now we get this move queen takes pawn being played. As you'll notice, the computer is giving black a very slight advantage here already because the rook is on an open file targeting the pawn, and black's pawns are all connected here. If you think about it a little bit like a snake, all these pawns are connected, and because they're connected, black structure is slightly better than white structure where you have 1 2 3 4 5 6, but you have this lone weakness on the a file. So Magnus goes bishop c6. We get the move e4 from Andreikin. We get bishop a4, queen c3, and now the move knight to c6. What Magnus wants to do here is play either d5 and attack in the center, or play knight b4 to fork the pawns on d3 and a2. Andreikin goes knight e5, and now we get knight to b4 here, and Andreikin decides to play this move queen to d2. Now, the reason that Andreikin did not go rook to a1 is that after rook to a1, black has this very nasty move, knight to c2, bishop guards the knight targets the rook, and if you move the rook to c1 after bishop b4, it's spaghetti-o time. The queen is simply stuck here on c3. There are no squares available, and you will lose the queen and most likely the game as well. So Andreikin goes queen d2, Magnus captures the pawn, we get rook a1, knight back to b4, and now we have the move f4 being played. Here Magnus plays bishop b5, we get the swap of the rooks, and Andreikin goes all in with this move g4, trying to attack very quickly on the king side. Now, I think against any player not named Magnus, there's a very good chance that at this point in the game, Andreikin would survive because the threat of g5 is very strong. This knight on b4 is a little bit weak. If you play d6 trying to kick the horse, after queen takes horse, pawn takes horse, queen takes bishop, it's game over, you lose. So normally I would be feeling very good about Andreikin's position if he were playing anyone but Magnus. However, he is playing against Magnus Carlsen. So Magnus trades the bishop for the knight, and Andreikin here decides to play knight takes bishop, and now Magnus takes the free pawn on g4. Andreikin goes to f5, trying to open up the diagonal for the queen to come in and attack towards the black king, and or push f6. We get the move queen to a7, king h1, and now Magnus plays d5, attacking the knight on c4. Here we get queen to f4 being played by Andreikin, and this is a move that effectively loses on the spot. That being said, after takes, the computer thinks that after queen to e2, hitting the bishop and the knight, and h5, and this weird move h3, white is only slightly worse. It's not game over yet, but in a blitz game, it's very, very unlikely for this to happen, and when you compound that with the fact that Andreikin is playing against Magnus, it becomes even more unlikely. So Andreikin plays queen to f4, Magnus goes h5, guarding the knight while still targeting the knight on c4. Here Andreikin plays move pawn takes pawn, and this allows Magnus to finish this game in a really neat fashion or style sense, you could say. So Magnus goes knight takes pawn, Andreikin plays queen to f3, attacking the knight, and now Magnus plays this move knight d to f2. The knights guard each other, the queen guards the knight, and Andreikin probably could resign, but being the good sport that he is, Andreikin actually plays out till checkmate. He goes king g1, we get knight h3, king to h1, and here there's the great queen sacrifice, queen to g1, and after rook takes queen and knight to f2, queen takes knight and knight takes queen, the game ends in a checkmate. This is a smothered checkmate here. The king has no squares available. The king is stuck in this corner. It cannot get out whatsoever. So a very, very beautiful checkmate for Magnus in this game. He gets a very, very nice win, and he moves to a score of 8 points out of 8. Now, I would also point out that the smothered checkmate is one of the earliest tactical patterns that I learned in the game of chess when I was studying as a complete beginner. So this is very near and dear to my heart, and this is also a pattern that at the beginner levels you should be very aware of. Normally, by the way, it will occur in a position. Let me just make some random moves. Normally it will occur in a position like this, for example. Let me just set it up like this, where black will go check, king goes over, and you check with a knight and a queen specifically, and then you get the checkmate like this. This is the most common pattern as opposed to having with 2 knights, but nonetheless it is a variation. So Magnus wins 8 out of 8, and now we're going to move to the next game where Magnus is on 8 points and he's playing against yours truly, the streamer Hikaru Nakamura. And in this game I am on 7 points out of 8. I've had 2 draws already, not having the greatest title Tuesday, but nonetheless, because Magnus is so far out ahead, I am paired against him. So for this game, we'll look at it from Magnus's perspective, since he does play an opening that I myself have played quite often. So we get knight f3, d5, we get to move b3, and here I play this move c5, trying to bring the knight out to c6 very quickly. Magnus goes e3, and now I play this move knight c6. Now, while I was making this up on the fly, very quickly after bishop b5 was played, I played this move f6, and the reason I played the setup is that I remembered a game that I played, I believe, against Vidit Santos Gujarati in a chess champions tour. I'm going to say 2023, might have been 2022, where after takes, and I think something like d4, Vidit played something very unusual with a king f7 very early, and the game actually became very, very sharp, and I was a little bit lucky to not end up in a lot of trouble. So I go f6 here, and now Magnus plays the move knight c3 instead. Now this move is not necessarily bad per se, but if you don't want to play d4 or bishop takes c6, it is really the only other option. So here I go e5, building the big black center. I've got these great pawns on the 5th rank, and it's looking pretty good. So Magnus trades the bishop for the knight, and now he goes bishop to a3. Now what Magnus is aiming for here is he intends to ignore most of the center, but he wants to spy this pawn on c5 and try to gang up and capture it. So I play this move bishop to a6 here. The reasoning behind this move is to stop white from castling here in this position. Additionally, if white plays d3, for example, now there's queen to a5, hitting both the knight and the bishop. And after bishop b2 and d4, I win this horse on c3. So white can't play d3. Another option I have down the road is that I can maybe even go c4, eliminating the double pawns. And after takes, now I have this really nice center once again. So it's a multi-purpose move, bishop to a6. I stop white from castling. I might want to go c4, and I have queen a5 as well. So Magnus goes knight to a4. I play the move queen to a5, and now he plays the enterprising move c4. Now the reason Magnus plays this move is that he understands that while he is temporarily sacrificing a pawn on c4 with this move queen c2, because these pawns are stacked on top of each other, I'm not really up a pawn in this position. Now, what you'll also notice is that Magnus has been moving very slowly. He's been using a lot of time to reach this point in the game. And around here is when I should probably start slowing down and trying to figure it out. So here I go bishop to b5, trying to put pressure on the knight as well as the pawn at the same time. And now Magnus plays this move queen c3. Now, shockingly, the computer thinks that white can castle here. And after pawn takes pawn and pawn takes, white can sack the rook. And after bishop takes f1 and rook takes f1, apparently white is better here due to the lack of black's development. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces on their original squares. Now, will this happen in blitz game? Almost certainly not, but it is worth pointing out nonetheless. So Magnus, being a human, he decides to play the move queen c3, trying to trade off the queens here. Now, as you'll note, computer thinks this is a mistake because castles was a better move, but I think this move makes a lot of sense. Now, this is where I played this move queen to a6. Now, during my live stream, because I was streaming this on my Kick channel, I did mention that I wanted to try and avoid an endgame here, which is why I did not trade the queens. Now, computer thinks that after takes and a move like knight to, I want to say knight to h6 here, knight to e4, knight f7, let's just say bishop takes c5, not bishop c5, sorry, because this would lose to f5 with takes where both the pieces are under attack. But something like knight takes c5, for example, now I can go a5 here, and there's some problems for white with the pin on the diagonal. There's a4. I can also stop white from castling still, and the computer gives an advantage. So this would have been the best choice, but I actually decided not to do it. And as I mentioned in the stream, is mainly because I thought I didn't want to go into an endgame against Magnus, who is the best endgame player of all time. So I play queen to a6. Now Magnus plays this move bishop takes c5, and this is where I very quickly play this move bishop takes a4 after using 1 second. Now this is the most critical moment of the game, and this is probably where I should have stopped and thought for a second, because when I go bishop takes a4, it does lead into an endgame. Now, as I had mentioned during my stream, I wanted to avoid an endgame, so I probably should have thought here. Now, if I used my time and come up with the best move, which is knight to e7 here, I do not think I would have ended up in any trouble in this game whatsoever. Now, the reason for this is that after knight to e7 here, white can't really castle once again because I can take, and so the best move the computer suggests is queen to b2. But after takes, and let's just say a move like knight to d5, bishop takes f8, and rook takes f6, let's just say castles, for example, and king f7, we end up in a position where I have these two rooks which can both go to the b8 square, but most importantly, this knight on d5 is anchored here. I can play c3, weak pawn, and this knight is the big difference versus the game, because in the game, when I take the knight on a4, we swap the bishops, Magnus takes on a4, and now I go knight e7, but after rook to c1, immediately this pawn on c4 is under attack, where in the other variations, just to illustrate the point, it was something like this, just to highlight it. The knight is already on d5, I'm already preparing to go rook b8, and it's a much better version, whereas in the game, after the move rook to c1, if I go knight d5 right away, white simply takes the pawn, and now I'm significantly worse. So I go queen takes pawn, Magnus trades. Worth pointing out here once again to show how strong computers truly are is that rook b8 is the best move, because if white castles here after queen takes a4, let's assume white trades. In this position, after king f7 and rook b2, black is doing very well. And the reason that black is doing very well here is that this king is on g1, whereas in the game, as we'll see in a second, the king on e2 guards his pawn on d2. So this is very, very deep and very, very complex and not really human at all. And if white tries to go king e2 with the idea of taking and going to this endgame, now black has rook to b4, and after queen to c3 and king f7, you can stack the rooks, you have queen b5 as well, and there's no endgame happening. So this would have been much better, but at the end of the day, I am only human, so I end up taking. We have takes. I go king f7, and now Magnus correctly puts his king on e2 here, and white has an advantage. Now, it's not an overwhelming advantage, but the main reason white is better is that I have this very weak pawn on c6 here, and I can't really mobilize the pawns in the center of the board. I can't go e4 because of takes. I can't go f5 because I hang the pawn on e5. So with these pawns in the center being fixed here, white can really target on these split pawns here on a7 and c6 and reroute this knight to d3 and potentially c5. So I go rook b8, Magnus plays rook c1, I go rook to b2, and now he plays the move rook to a4, guarding the pawn on a2 but also targeting the pawn on a7. I go king e6, we get knight to e1, I go a5, knight d3, and now I play the rook to b5. Here Magnus goes check, I go over, and he plays knight e4, king c7, and now he plays this move a3. Now this is an excellent move from Magnus, because what a3 does is it stops me from moving the rook to b4. If white goes h3, I go rook to b4. White has a problem with the knight and the rook. Now we can trade the rooks here, but if one set of rooks come off the board, these weaknesses cannot be attacked as easily, and I also control the open b file. So Magnus plays a3, it stops rook to b4 here, and white continues to keep the idea of attacking the pawn on a5 or swinging the rook back to c4. Here I go rook d8, Magnus plays g4, another phenomenal move, positional move here, as it stops f5 kicking the knight, and this knight now has a temporary bastion here. If I go g6, I lose the pawn, so this knight cannot really ever be removed from the e4 square, where it targets the pawns. It can go to c5 or guard the pawn on d2. I go king b6, Magnus plays rook c4, and now I play rook b3. We got knight c5, and I go back to b5. Now rook takes a3 is not a move here, because after rook to b1, checking the king here. If I go to a7, there's rook b7, winning the horse on e7. And if I go to c7, there are probably multiple ways to win, but the cleanest is simply knight to e6, forking the king and the rook. And after takes, and rook to b7, rook is on the 7th. You've got some kebabs, and white will win the game. So I go back to b5, Magnus plays knight e6, I go rook g8, guarding the pawn on g7, and now we have the move h4. Here I go g6, Magnus plays rook to c2, and now I play rook c8. We get the move f4 here, and this is where we're at a situation where both players are down to about 30 seconds on the clock, and you have to start picking up the speed. Now the computer considers this an inaccuracy, but I really do like this move fundamentally, because white does need to push either to f4 or to d4. At this point, the weaknesses that I have on c6 and a5 are very well defended, so white needs to create some more play and open up the position. So we get f4. Here I play this move knight to d5. Now I probably should have traded here, and after takes, f5, g5, and rook d8, the show goes on. White is better. A computer would obviously draw this with no issue as black, but nonetheless, it's a very difficult position to play. Instead, I play the move knight to d5. Magnus trades on e5, and now I actually have 3 pawn islands. I have a pawn on a5, pawn on c6, and pawn on e5. And with these 3 pawn islands, there are now 3 weaknesses in the position, and it's very, very difficult to defend. Magnus plays knight to c5 here, threatening to go knight d7, forking the king and the pawn. So now I go rook c7. Magnus plays knight to d3, and now I play the move knight to f6, so that the rook on b5 guards the pawn on e5. Here, Magnus plays a4. I go rook to d5, and now he plays this move e4, attacking the rook on d5. Here I can no longer keep the rook on the 5th rank here. The pawn on a4 covers the square. Pawn on e4 threatens to capture the rook, and the rook on c4 guards this pawn from being captured on e4. So I go rook to d6, Magnus plays knight takes e5, and now I play the move rook e6. And here Magnus makes an inaccuracy with this move g5. Computer says that after d4, white is completely winning. The reason Magnus did not play this, of course, is that it hangs the pawn on e4. But after g5, knight g3, and king d3, I guess white has some rook b2, rook c5 idea, and white's winning. But in a situation where both players are low on time, really not realistic whatsoever. So Magnus goes g5, and this is where I use quite a bit of time before playing knight h5, but after this move, the game is effectively over. Where I spent all my time calculating was takes, and rook to e6. Ultimately, I did not play this because I felt that after moves like d3, takes, e5, rook f5, and d4 here, white is pushing the pawns forward. There's rook b2, there's also passed e pawn, and it feels very awkward and difficult to play. Nonetheless, after g5, takes, and king e3, and a move like rook g3, king e4, rook g6, it still probably is defendable, but it's very, very difficult here because after rook b2 and king a6, the king is on the very edge of the board. White has these pawns going up, and I also have a weak h pawn as well. So with 3 pawn islands in this position, it still is pretty unlikely that I will be able to survive. So instead, I end up playing the move knight to h5, missing that white can simply go d4, and now Magnus has a big white center. He's up a pawn, the knight on e5 is guarded, and it pressures the pawn on c6, and here I can already pretty much resign. Now I play the move rook to d6, Magnus goes king e3, and I blunder with this move rook to e7. At this point, the game is over pretty much regardless of what I do. If I play rook e6, there's rook to c5 here, followed by knight to c4, winning this pawn on a5, and that will be all she wrote. So I play rook e7, sort of out of panic, just moving quickly. I hang this pawn on c6, and after takes, king b7, and rook c5, I simply resign the game here because Magnus is already up 2 pawns in the center of the board, but the a5 pawn is falling, and with this knight on the rim, there's really no counterplay whatsoever. So great technical masterpiece by Magnus in this endgame. I had some chances early in the game, but once we got to this endgame phase, Magnus simply played a great game, and there really wasn't a whole lot that I could have done. Now, a computer will say, well, it was obviously fine. A computer would have drawn it, but we have to remember these are humans, and humans are not as good as computers are or ever will be. So that is the moral of the story. Magnus plays a great endgame. I do not think I probably would have lost this endgame to anyone else, if I'm being completely honest, but it really does show just how great Magnus is. So Magnus would go on to win this game, move to 9 out of 9. He would proceed to win round 10 against Andrew Tang, and then in round 11 he had a great game which he won with the white pieces against Jeffrey Zhang to complete the perfect score, going 11 points out of 11. Now for Magnus, this is the second time that he's achieved immortality with a perfect score in Title Tuesday. He had done it once before, but overall is only the fourth time it has ever happened, and the only two players to achieve their perfect scores are myself, I've done it twice, and now Magnus Carlsen, who's also done it twice. And it's kind of fitting in a way that the two best Blitz players have the 4 perfect scores in the most prestigious online chess Blitz tournament. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from the evening Title Tuesday on August 6, 2024. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and I will be back soon with some more great recaps. I think tomorrow we have Hans versus Anish, so stay tuned for all of that, but enjoy the rest of your evening and have a great time. Bye.